yes, I am the former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion, but actually my activism goes back much further than that. I'm one of these people who was concerned genuinely about the environment, about environmental causes. I grew up worrying about the ozone layer, problem that we fixed using science. And when you're concerned about these issues, there's only really one place to go. You go to Greenpeace, you go to Friends of the Earth. And I was involved in all of these organizations. I was involved in smaller organizations like Camp for Climate Action, which doesn't exist anymore, but was very, very active doing direct action years before Extinction Rebellion was doing the same thing. I was involved in Amnesty International. I used to volunteer for Oxfam. I did all of the things that, we kind of think of as those are the good things to do. These are the good organizations. These are the good guys. And I still think that even with awareness of some of these organizations have done some things that aren't so good, even so, we still have a perception that they're the good guys. Most of us do. And that's because they market themselves and they brand themselves as really good organizations. But what if I tell you that I was only a kid, so only 13, 14 years old, kind of getting interested in these issues, and I signed up to Greenpeace and they instantly sent me literature about three-eyed fish because of nuclear energy. I was just a kid. We're not taught about this at school. They don't teach a program about nuclear energy at school or about radiation even. And these groups really feed on that fear, that radiophobia that, again, many of us kind of naturally have. And it's sensible to have some awareness of this. It's sensible to think, none of us want to live through an atom bomb exploding. We understand that. But everything in the world comes down to the quantity, right? The dose makes the poison. So it's true with radiation. In small quantities, actually, it can be very good for your health. And nuclear medicine saves millions of lives. But in some examples where, it has been damaging, they use that. And they use that by taking fear, natural fear, a generation's natural fear of weapons after they saw the consequences of what happened in Hiroshima, for example. And they use that to turn people against energy as well. So I had that fear, even though I didn't grow up around that time. And I learned about this in history at school, but I didn't grow up with this fear of I didn't grow up in a Cold War. But a lot of the people in these organizations had. C&D as well, that was another group I was in. A lot of them were older people and they genuinely had this fear, but it was all coming from organizations. It was not a natural fear, but it was feeding on a natural fear. And you see the same thing with gene editing or genetic modification. So for years, I was fed the same information from multiple different groups, from all of these groups, actually. WWF, that's another example, very heavy campaigners against nuclear energy telling you the same misinformation. Once you've heard it for years and years, it's very hard to break out of that. And actually, it can become a part of your identity. And I think, that feeds into what Chris was saying about, well, why don't they then accept other solutions when they come along? Well, because it's such a big part of your identity. It's almost like a religion. It's hard to leave that. It's hard to step away from that and say, actually, I attended anti-nuclear protests. That's a hard thing to do, is to step back and say, well, I was wrong. Right? So, and then I did do that. And then I lost my entire community. And I'm talking about people that I campaigned with, that I went on TV to bat for, that I blocked roads with, that I was arrested for, completely turned on me. Well, you're just an industry shill. And I would say, you're not welcome in the environmental movement. That's what I was told. And I would say, I earned my stripes in this movement. You don't get to decide what it is, actually, because the causes are legit. We should care about these causes. That's why we solved the problem with the ozone layer, right? We came together, we worked out we need to ban CFCs, we worked out a way around it, way to do it, and then we watched it heal. We didn't even know that would happen. But the solutions are there in almost every instant. There is almost nothing that humans can't solve. We've got an asteroid hurtling towards Earth. We're working out solutions for when it comes back around and may or may not hit us. So going off tangent slightly, but basically, to wrap it up. So I was in these groups. I was told genetic modification is bad. Organic is the solution. Nuclear energy is bad. Renewables are the solution. And you're fed it again and again. And I actually did start to question it, but I was actively shut down when I did question it, because when you question it, you're questioning someone else's religion, well, why are you asking that question about nuclear? That's not welcome here. I was actually told that in the Green Party, and I quit. I left the party because I didn't like that they didn't let me ask a question at a public event where they were discussing energy. And I just wanted to ask the metavis scientists on the panel, well, what do you think of nuclear? Because I've heard a lot of bad stuff about it. And they didn't let him answer the question. They said, we already know it's bad. The host said, we already know it's bad. And he didn't get to answer. But I tracked him down afterwards because now I was angry that they didn't answer, even if it was just to confirm what I already thought, which is, yeah, we don't need it. Renewables will do everything. And I tracked him down and I said, can you answer my question? And he said, well, of course, we can't just do it with wind and solar. The IPCC says that. It says we need nuclear as well. So this was like a really brain-shattering moment for me where my whole world crumbled because I thought, if they've lied about that, what else have I been lied about? And as I say, stepped away and was completely rejected by many of these people, many of the older people. A lot of the younger people actually are a bit more sensible now, I find, and they kind of looked into it themselves and said, yeah, we don't understand why this is such a big problem. But they still have these groups coming at them with the same myths that you've heard for decades, kind of influencing them. Oh, well, you know, maybe it is safe, but we just don't need it. And all this other nonsense, which is, you know, goes against the scientific consensus that they then tell you to follow. Literally, that's what we would say in Extinction Rebellion. Follow the science, but not that science over there. Follow the science in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the 1.5 warming report, where it tells you that this is a climate crisis and we have to deal with it. But the chapter on mitigation by Working Group 3, we're going to ignore that because it says you should use nuclear and you can't just have wind and solar without nuclear. So that must have been because, you know, somebody lobbied the scientists. That's what I dealt with for years. And I did step away and I did stop being vocal about it, mostly because people were afraid to, because the attacks you get when you come out and speak for these things were pretty awful back when I started doing it. It's much less common now because it's become much more acceptable and people are willing to have this conversation. And, you know, there's quite a lot of support in the UK, for example, for nuclear energy and gene editing. But it's been a hard slog to get here. It's been... I can't over-explain how much they keep you in their religion. They keep you in, essentially, I mean, I did write a piece saying it's basically like a cult, because as soon as you voice anything different, you're out. And that was my experience of a lot of these groups. And it's why I essentially broke with all of them, from the Green Party through to Extinction Rebellion. And, you know, as Chris has already covered and is covered in the pamphlet there, it's because they don't really want those solutions. They don't care that organic farming requires more land and therefore is actually worse for the environment than using the fertilizers. They don't care about that. They live in this religious type kind of fervor that is based around the living on the land fallacy, which is about we all go back to nature. We live a simpler life. Science has taken that from us. So actually, we need to work out how to get rid of all these technologies. Which is, of course, absurd because literally everything is technology, from your clothes to your glass to my glasses. You know, we live with these aids that are very beneficial to humanity. And if you really dig deep, it's very dark, actually. If you really dig deep into what these groups believe, I would say to people, well, what about wheelchairs? Do you think, or what about medicine for ill people? And some of the more extreme people would just say, those people have to just die out then. And that's where I really just said, I can't be part of a movement where some of the main people in this group, he's in jail at the moment, actually, which is why they're not doing that many actions, but he's the main driver. You know who I'm talking about. I worked with him and he genuinely believes what I'm saying, but he just doesn't care. Well, if lots of people have to die, they have to die. And I think that's really tragic. And I come from a completely different perspective, which is that we should use technology to lift us up. And it's very beneficial, actually. And none of us want to live on the land. And all the people that most shout for it are the ones that live with the privilege of not having to wash their own clothes and grow their own rice like my parents did in India before they migrated here in the 60s. So, yeah, there's a lot of different reasons. But I do think essentially it's from the people that believe that. And then they feed it to everyone else. And if you're young or you're just susceptible, you know, to misinformation, it's very easy to believe something that you're told in many different ways by many different people over a very long period of time. So do give them a little bit of grace for, you know, it's not their fault necessarily that they're fed essentially what is propaganda, but we do need to keep up the calling it out and creating pamphlets like this, for example, because there's still a lot of people that are interested in environmental causes and think, oh wow, I want to do something about climate change. And where do they go? They go to these groups, and these, a lot of these NGOs are not actually the good guys. I wanted to answer Martin's question, and also it kind of feeds into what Chris said earlier. Why don't people follow the science? So this is my field, and actually I didn't answer your question properly because you said, are these activists less rational than other people? But if we're talking about science literacy, are they less science literate? My experience is that most people aren't very science literate, and that's backed up by data that about 10% of the country has a good level of science understanding, according to the modelling that we use within science communication, looking at basic understanding of, for example, scientific principles like scientific consensus. So, and that's not actually a UK thing. That's quite a broad thing across the West, that you typically don't get a lot of people in these fields who really understand the data. So you can put all the data you want in front of someone, but it's very hard for most people to actually sift apart, what's a good study versus a bad study. This study has 5 people and that has 1,500. That to me is kind of, something obvious, but most people, they're not capable of doing that. And I'm not saying that as a derogatory thing. It's a hard thing to do. We're not wired to do this. We're wired for, and this feeds into the idea of risk perception. Why are we so bad at risk perception? We are. Most of us don't worry about getting in a car. Actually, statistically, you're much more likely to get in an accident than flying, but most of us have a fear of flying. It's like just like an inner feeling, really, isn't it? It's a bit like the living on the land fallacy. It feeds into our confirmation bias. I have vibes about this. I have a fear about this. I have a fear that, nuclear kind of is scary. I don't really understand how it works, and that things did happen with weapons. Alcohol, does make you feel bad if you drink too much. Probably there's something in that. Maybe it is making you sick. And it's interesting because both of these things, which are very different things, the alcohol thing is very different to the nuclear energy. The fear that the activists feed on is cancer. In both instances, the radiophobia that people use, people kind of feed with their narratives in the anti-nuclear space, it's all about cancer. It's all about you'll get sick, and look at what happened to these people that got radiation poisoning. And all of those things are real, and they're true, that they happen not from energy but from weapons. But most people can't make that differentiation. They don't understand the difference. And again, frankly, we're not teaching this very basic stuff in schools. Unless you go on to study it, you don't learn this. It's very easy then for someone else to control that narrative and come in with scary stories. And we are very receptive to stories. Of course we are. We are storytellers. This is just a human thing. And if someone comes in with a really good, clever story, and someone else comes in with a 20-page, document with figures and graphs, which one are you going to believe? You're going to believe the one that tells you a story. It might not be a nice story, might be a scary story about some little kid who suffered from cancer because they had a power plant and it was all scary. This is a real story, actually. It's called Die Wolke, and it's a German book. It's a science fiction book, and it's taught across German schools, and it has been for decades. And I actually think it's one of the reasons that Germans are particularly so fearful of nuclear, because I read that book just out of interest. It terrified me. This poor little girl, and she watches her, and her family dies, and she has to bury her brother, and then she gets radiation poisoning, and then people are like discriminatory towards her because her hair falls out. It's terrible. It's a terrible story, but it's feeding on real fears of real things that happened. And then we feel that that's more true than that 20-page document, which I'll probably flick through, but won't necessarily understand. So there's an issue of science literacy, and therefore getting ahead of data when it comes out, as you said, getting it in front of the right people, but explaining it. Because frankly, I've spoken to politicians who have low science literacy. They don't have a clue. You talk to them about nuclear and they're like, oh, well, isn't it bad? I read something from this report. Yeah, Greenpeace wrote that report. We need to look at sources. We need to look at sample sizes. We need to look at the full literature, the full spectrum. And if you're not sure, then get someone in who can do it, not someone from an activist organisation, because they'll have their own biases, whether they're doing it intentionally or not. Although, as I said, a lot of them are doing it intentionally. Their purpose is to scare you. And then you can make a rational decision. Now, a lot of these people have documents in front of them on every different issue, and they don't have the ability to go through or the capability to go through each thing and work out for themselves what's true and what isn't true. Because I read in this paper that just one drink And then I know someone who died and they did have one drink. And that's it. That's it. But that is literally what happens with everything in this pamphlet, and far more issues. It happens with every new technology. It's happening now with AI. AI is going to take your jobs and it's going to destroy the world, and there'll be AGI and the robots will control us. And it sounds ridiculous, but people truly believe it. They might not think too much about, the extremes of that logic and think, well, that's ridiculous. They just kind of live over here, going by vibes. I will get in a car, but I don't want to go near a nuclear power plant. You sleep next to someone at night, you get more radiation exposure from that person than you do from walking around a nuclear power plant. You can measure it. We're very lucky we have tools where you can do that. But that's already a step beyond the feelings, right? I'm already explaining beyond the feelings. So it's really important that actually, and I say this because I do think some of it is on the scientists, some of it is on the rest of us, because we don't get ahead with the stories, and I believed all the stories. And then I started telling news stories. They're true stories. But I started telling news stories, and I even had some scientists and some nuclear scientists come out and say, well, you can't say, there was one phrase that I popularized, which was nuclear saves life. You can't really say that, Zion, that it's a bit misleading. And I said, no, it's not. It's the title of a paper produced by the grandfather of climate science, Professor James Hansen, right? He wrote a paper, he calculated the number of lives left when Germany banned nuclear and Japan banned nuclear and then went back to burning coal. And he calculated it to be around 1,000 a month. And he said, that's real data and all of the numbers are there for you to see. And then they said, oh yeah, well, we didn't know about that. Carry on. But actually there was some gatekeeping there, because sometimes the very technical people don't want you to tell stories. But let me tell you something, if you don't tell the story, the other side will, and they will be believed. And then it is very hard to fix once those beliefs are ingrained. You're just firefighting. You have to get ahead with this sort of stuff, really. And all I do most of the time now is firefight. And if you don't believe me and think I'm exaggerating, consider nuclear. What do you think when you think of nuclear? Because most people think waste. That came from activists. You don't think waste when you think about coal, but there's waste. It's stored in the Earth's atmosphere, right? We breathe it in. There's waste. It's not managed. Nuclear waste is highly well managed, ridiculously well managed, it's stupidly well managed. It's so stupidly safe. It's so boring. I know, I've been there. I've looked at the cast. Is that it? Really? I spent 10 years afraid of this thing because I was told the waste, and we all believe it. We all believe it. Anyone new that I speak to about nuclear, what about Fukushima? What about Chernobyl? What about waste? It's always the same things. That messaging came from somewhere, and it's on us to tell the better stories to get people back to somewhere a bit more reasonable using the data. But to be honest, the data's not that important. It's the story that's important.